ASMR. I was about the age of 13 when this story took place. I lived in an old house just on the outside of a large city. The city was surrounded by cornfields and forests filled with beautiful trees. I had lived there all of my life before this happened. It was a dreary summer night, which is mostly normal for the place that I live in. But on this particular night, something just felt off. I had come home from soccer practice around 6 p.m., and at that point my parents always made me go to bed by 8. The night went on as usual. I ate dinner, played with my little sister, and did some weightlifting before bed. I got into bed around 7:45. Now I have to tell you that normally I toss and turn all night long. I toss and turn, and I'm constantly waking up over and over again. But on this particular night, something was strange. This was the first night in years that I actually slept for hours. I slept for hours until a noise suddenly woke me up. It was coming from the bathroom. Since my bladder was full anyway, I decided to go investigate. I thought maybe it's a mouse or a bat, since we lived in a really old house, and sometimes holes get in the older walls. I didn't see anything, so I just used the toilet and then washed my hands. I decided to splash some water on my face. As I looked up at the mirror that overhangs the sink, I rubbed the water from my eyes. My vision was a little blurry, so I couldn't really see much, but I thought I saw something behind me. Thinking that it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I dried my face off and looked up at the mirror again. Right behind me, there was a little girl clutching my body, almost as if she was hiding from something, almost as if I was her human shield. Her ghostly outline scared me at first. I was startled into stiffness. I breathed heavy, but I was frozen and just kept looking in that mirror at this little girl. I could tell that whatever was scaring her was coming from the basement. So I walked to my basement door, and I opened it slightly at first because I was really scared of what might be behind it. That being said, I'd lived in this house my whole life, and I'd never been in the basement. My dad mentioned to me that it had 3 separate parts, all separated by small windows that you could barely fit through. So I walked down the basement steps and got down to the bottom where the light switch was. I nervously turned it on. I looked around and everything seemed like it was okay. Everything looked normal. That's until I heard what sounded like crying from one of the other parts of the basement. In my mind, I was thinking, oh heck no. But in my heart, I knew I had to see what it was. So I ventured through the part of the basement that the light couldn't reach to the other side. It was pitch black. I still heard the crying, but since it was so dark, I couldn't see anything. I don't know what, but something gave me the urge to go to the far corner of the room, because the way the moonlight reflected off of the floor, you could kind of see with the little light that you had, just a little bit. I walked over to the corner and stayed directly in the middle of the room. I looked around. There in the middle of the room was a chair. It had shackles for the feet and what looked to be some kind of restraint for arms. That's when I noticed that there was someone sitting in that chair. I walked closer, only to reveal that it was the same little girl ghost that had been crying in the bathroom. She was crying. Tears streamed down her cheek. There were needles stuck in her arms, draining some type of fluid into her. All was quiet until she started screaming. I shook with fear. It was so high-pitched, I thought it sounded like a siren or something of that nature. She was saying words that I couldn't make out until she spoke 5 menacing words that made my heart sink. She said, "Get out. Daddy is coming." Not even thinking twice, I sprinted up the basement stairs, tripping over my own feet, and fell flat on my face once I reached the top step. I got back up and ran to my parents' room. I told them what had happened. They went down there and checked everything out. I told them all about the chair, the girl screaming, the bathroom mirror. They told me there was no chair and that there had never been 3 parts. I was about the age of 13 when this story took place. I lived in an old house just on the outside of a large city. The city was surrounded by cornfields and forests filled with beautiful trees. I had lived there all of my life before this happened. It was a dreary summer night, which is mostly normal for the place that I live in. But on this particular night, something just felt off. I had come home from soccer practice around 6 p.m. and at that point my parents always made me go to bed by 8. The night went on as usual. I ate dinner, played with my little sister, and did some weightlifting before bed. I got into bed around 7:45. Now I have to tell you that normally I toss and turn all night long. I toss and turn and I'm constantly waking up over and over again. But on this particular night, something was strange. This was the first night in years that I actually slept for hours. I slept for hours until a noise suddenly woke me up. It was coming from the bathroom. Since my bladder was full anyway, I decided to go investigate. I thought maybe it's a mouse or a bat, since we lived in a really old house, and sometimes holes get in the older walls. I didn't see anything, so I just used the toilet and then washed my hands. I decided to splash some water on my face. As I looked up at the mirror that overhangs the sink, I rubbed the water from my eyes. My vision was a little blurry, so I couldn't really see much, but I thought I saw something behind me. Thinking that it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I dried my face off and looked up at the mirror again. Right behind me, there was a little girl clutching my body, almost as if she was hiding from something, almost as if I was her human shield. Her ghostly outline scared me at first. I was startled into stiffness. I breathed heavy, but I was frozen and just kept looking in that mirror at this little girl. I could tell that whatever was scaring her was coming from the basement. So I walked to my basement door and I opened it slightly at first because I was really scared of what might be behind it. That being said, I'd lived in this house my whole life, and I'd never been in the basement. My dad mentioned to me that it had 3 separate parts, all separated by small windows that you could barely fit through. So I walked down the basement steps and got down to the bottom where the light switch was. I nervously turned it on. I looked around and everything seemed like it was okay. Everything looked normal. That's until I heard what sounded like crying from one of the other parts of the basement. In my mind, I was thinking, oh heck no. But in my heart, I knew I had to see what it was. So I ventured through the part of the basement that the light couldn't reach to the other side. It was pitch black. I still heard the crying, but since it was so dark, I couldn't see anything. I don't know what, but something gave me the urge to go to the far corner of the room, because the way the moonlight reflected off of the floor, you could kind of see with the little light that you had, just a little bit. I walked over to the corner and stayed directly in the middle of the room. I looked around. There in the middle of the room was a chair. It had shackles for the feet and what looked to be some kind of restraint for arms. That's when I noticed that there was someone sitting in that chair. I walked closer, only to reveal that it was the same little girl ghost that had been crying in the bathroom. She was crying. Tears streamed down her cheek. There were needles stuck in her arms, draining some type of fluid into her. All was quiet until she started screaming. I shook with fear. It was so high-pitched, I thought it sounded like a siren or something of that nature. He was saying words that I couldn't make out until she spoke 5 menacing words that made my heart sink. She said, "Get out. Daddy is coming." Not even thinking twice, I sprinted up the basement stairs, tripping over my own feet, and fell flat on my face once I reached the top step. I got back up and ran to my parents' room. I told them what had happened. They went down there and checked everything out. I told them all about the chair, the girl screaming, the bathroom mirror. They told me there was no chair and that there had never been 3 parts. When my grandfather got out of the army, he worked the passenger lift in the Empire Hotel. He was always surprised to hear Americans call the lift an elevator. It seemed so unfancy to him. He loved the work, the people he'd meet, and the pay was good. He was really proud of his job. He worked the lift from noontime until midnight, Monday through Friday. He loved the conversations he'd have, especially with Colonel Saxby, for it was he that got my grandfather the job. The colonel insisted that a soldier was the perfect man for the job, as they are civil and businesslike. They had many a good joke and exchanged stories every time my grandfather took him up to his 4th floor room, number 210. Now, the colonel always rode up the lift, but he never ever took the lift down. For some reason, he preferred to take the stairs down. My grandfather enjoyed hearing the small children chatter away as their parents pretended not to listen, and watching the ladies admire themselves in the mirrors on the way down to the lobby, having pleasant conversations with the older gentlemen who needed to sit and rest on the red velvet cushioned seats that adorned the lift. He really did love that job, until one evening in particular. He had just finished letting his last rider off at the 2nd floor, as it was approaching 11:58. As was policy, my grandfather would shut down the lift at midnight, the end of his shift. He would then leave the keys at the front desk, where the desk clerk would store them for the morning shift man. As he was closing the lift and preparing to end his shift, midnight hit. Not a second later, the elevator buzzed. It was someone on the 4th floor needing assistance. Even though it was midnight, my grandfather figured maybe it was someone unaware of the rules, and he'd let it slip by just this once. As he opened the lift doors at the top of the 4th floor, however, he was surprised to see the colonel standing there, looking pale as ever, wrapped in a warm military jacket. It was an odd situation, for you see, the colonel hadn't used the lift at all in a few days, as he'd been ill, and he never, ever took the lift down. He only rode it up. "I'm glad to see you're feeling better, sir," my grandfather said. The colonel didn't even look at him. He said nothing and stepped into the lift. It was a very uneasy ride down, as my grandfather felt too awkward to make any small talk, as the colonel hadn't even made eye contact with him or acknowledged his presence. So he figured he better leave well enough alone and just take him down. He dropped him off at the lobby and watched him as he left, walking out the front door and into the cold winter's night, never acknowledging his presence, never saying goodnight, never even saying hello. It was as if he was in a trance. Grandfather walked his keys over to the front desk and spoke to Ryan, the clerk. Good thing he's got a warm coat on. Ryan, who was still staring after Colonel Saxby, says, "Yes, it's quite odd that he be going out into such cold weather, and this late at night, as I've heard he's been quite ill." 2 minutes later, a man with a briefcase walked rushedly through the door and straight towards the lift. "I'm sorry, sir, the lift is shut down for the evening," Grandfather called to him. The man stomped his foot and glared at him. "Nonsense. It's a matter of life and death. Take me upstairs to the 4th floor at once." Grandfather took the keys back and did as he was told. As they reached the 4th floor, Grandfather asked who was so sick. "A man named Colonel Saxby. He's gravely ill," said the man. "Oh, no, sir," Grandfather said. "You must be mistaken. I've just taken him downstairs about 5 minutes ago, and he went out for the evening. The front desk clerk and I saw him leave." The man was about to speak when a woman in a nurse uniform walked out of the colonel's room, room 210. "No worse, I hope?" the man said. "I'm afraid it's bad news," the nurse said. "He died 5 minutes ago." "That's impossible," Grandfather exclaimed. "I'm telling you, he rode down the lift 5 minutes ago." "Oh, for goodness sakes," the nurse said. "Come see for yourself," and led him into the room. There, on his bed, was the colonel, still wearing his coat, pale as a sheet, white as a ghost, staring straight ahead, the same expression he'd had on his face as he stood in the lift, ignoring my grandfather. My grandfather refused to help carry the colonel downstairs and quit his job on the spot. I've never been one to get sick. Other than the sniffles here and there, it was extremely rare that I would have a stomach virus or a terrible cough. Even as an adult, I never really seemed to catch what my kids do. The crud and the crusties seem to jump from the kids to my wife, skipping me over entirely. There's been only one time in my life that I was violently ill. I was 10 years old. My stomach had been hurting all night long, and I got very little sleep. I wasn't the type of kid that faked sick or liked missing a lot of school. I actually liked school back then. So I thought I could tough it out. I took my shower. I nibbled on some dry toast my mother had made me and stood outside waiting for the bus. All of a sudden, I was hit with the worst wave of nausea I've ever experienced in my life and have never experienced since then. I didn't even see it coming. It just happened. I was immediately sick all over the ground. My poor mother happened to witness the disgusting scene from our front window and called me back inside. She called the school to let them know I wouldn't be there, and she had me go upstairs and lay in my bed. She tried to stay home with me, but she couldn't get anyone to cover her shift at work. My father was already at work, so the only option was for me to stay alone. This was in the early 80s, so it wasn't totally unusual for parents to leave their children home alone for a few hours without too much worry of getting in trouble with the law or anything like that. But I know that my mom felt really guilty. However, back then her boss was kind of a tyrant, and he definitely would have fired her had she not gone into work. And we needed both of my mom and dad's paychecks to survive back then. I drifted in and out of sleep after my mom left. At some point, I woke up with another wave of nausea and quickly tried to unwrap myself from the cocoon of warm blankets and put my feet on the floor to make it to the bathroom in time. But I just couldn't. It happened again, all over the hardwood floor. Even though there was no one there, I shed tears of frustration and embarrassment, and I just felt so weak that I fell back into bed, feeling like I could barely move. I was suddenly very thirsty too, and hot and sweaty and just miserable. I knew there was a glass of water somewhere. I just couldn't focus my eyes to see it. I fell back, closed my eyes, and drifted off again. I'm not sure how long I was out for, but the next thing I remember, I was awoken to a wet feeling on my cheeks. Someone was wiping my face with a cold washcloth. I was finally able to get my eyes open long enough to focus in on the face. It was my grandmother. My mom must have called her and asked her to come check on me. She smiled at me and patted my forehead with a wet washcloth. I was sick on the floor, I said, starting to cry, horribly embarrassed. Grandma shook her head and wiped my tears. Don't you even think on it. I've taken care of it. It's not your fault. It's happened to everyone once in a while. You just rest. Don't worry about it. Then she handed me a nice cold glass of water. Here, drink this. It'll help cool you down. I gratefully drank the water in small sips. Now, she said matter-of-factly, this is going to sound a little strange, but trust me, I think you would feel much better if you took a cold shower. I know the thought of it sounds yucky, but just for a few minutes, it'll help bring down your body temperature. I looked at her like she had two heads, but this was Grandma, so I did as she asked. I stepped into the cool shower and shivered. I wanted to immediately jump back out, but I held strong and let the water rush over my warm forehead. I've laid out some fresh pajamas for you. Now I want you to put these on the minute you get out, okay? Yes, Grandma, I answered. Also, I've left a ginger ale for you on your nightstand. Sip it slowly when you get out. It should help your stomach. Thank you, Grandma, I said. I lathered up with some soap and let the water rinse the suds from my body. Then I stepped out and dried off with a towel. I put on the warm pajamas, wondering how they could possibly be warm. Had Grandma had time to put them in the dryer? How long had she been there? Then I took 2 sips from the can of ginger ale and set it back down on my nightstand, then crawled into bed. I sat up and waited to see if Grandma was going to come back up and check on me, but after a while, I just drifted back off to sleep again. The next thing I knew, my mother was shaking me awake. She asked me how I was feeling. I said much better. She put her hand on my forehead and said I wasn't warm, so that was a good thing. Is Grandma still here? I asked. Mom looked at me funny. What do you mean? She asked. Grandma, is she still here? I took a shower like she told me to, but when she went back downstairs, she never came back up again. Mom put her hand on my forehead again. Are you sure you feel all right? Yes, I said. Why? Mom looked at me with a very worried expression. Because, honey, you know Grandma passed away last year. She couldn't have been here. I'm a little worried that you were hallucinating, or maybe you were dreaming. You must have been feverish. I shook a little bit because I suddenly knew that she was right. It all suddenly flooded back to me. I knew my grandmother was dead. I don't know how I could have possibly forgotten that. Here's the thing. I could have easily dreamed that my grandmother visited me. I could have easily dreamed that I threw up on the floor, so naturally it wouldn't be there when I woke up. However, there's one thing that I can't explain. After my mother left the room to get the thermometer to make sure that I really was okay and not feverish, I looked over at my nightstand and there was a can of ginger ale opened. We never kept ginger ale in the house. Say my name. When I was 13 years old, I lived 5 minutes from my best friend. The walk from my house to her house was one that I made many, many times. In April of that year, her family went on a week-long vacation to Florida, and I had promised that I would feed their cat Scruffy and clean the litter box while they were gone. So every day after school, I would walk over, get the cat food from under the sink, pour some in the bowl, put fresh water out, and scoop a little litter. Very easy. I was in and out in 5 to 10 minutes. Now, the day before they were due back, something happened that I can't explain. I went into the house like I normally did, and I noticed that the cupboard underneath the sink was already open, and the cat food was missing. Now, they had told me that if we ran out of cat food, there would be some in the hall closet or in the basement. So I went over to the hall closet and opened it up. As I'm rummaging through the boxes, I swear to you, I heard my name. Emily. Emily. I turned around, startled because I recognized that voice. It was my best friend. I was really confused because they weren't due home until the next day. I stepped away from the closet and looked around. There was nobody there. I figured I'd imagined it. I didn't see the cat food in the closet, so I made my way down to the basement reluctantly. I noticed that there was a big, brand new bag of unopened cat food on a shelf right next to the boiler. As I reached to grab the cat food, I heard someone call my name from the top of the stairs, "Emily, Emily." I grabbed the cat food, and believe it or not, I can't even explain why I did this, but I ran upstairs towards the voice because I recognized it as my best friend's voice. I ran up those stairs and said, "Yes, I'm here. I'm right here. I'm getting the cat food." When I reached the top of the stairs, I instinctively slammed the door behind me because I was just so frightened, so creeped out. I looked around. No one was there. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know why I was scared if I thought it was my best friend's voice. But I was. I quickly poured the cat food into the bowl and ran outside and looked everywhere. There was no cars in the driveway. There was nobody in the yard. There was nobody anywhere. Without cleaning the litter box or checking to see if the cat had water, I locked the door behind me and ran home as quick as I could. When I got home, I had a phone call. It was my best friend saying that she couldn't wait to come home and play with her cat. I explained to her what had happened, and she started to laugh, thinking I was joking. I wasn't joking. I can't explain what happened. And to this day, I still get chills when I walk by her house. I don't live in the area anymore, and neither does she. But when I go to visit my parents, I just get this creepy feeling when I walk by her house. I also refused to spend the night at her house anymore. Everyone thought I was exaggerating and that I was nuts. But I know what I heard. The bedroom. My name is Rachel. I have an older sister named Penny. Penny and I had always shared a bedroom. She was 3 years older than me, but we had always been very close. She always stuck up for me and included me in her plans. I always looked up to her and thought she could do no wrong. All of that changed when we moved into the house on 13 Grove Street. At the time, I was 14 and Penny was 17. Our new bedroom was huge. It had a large walk-in closet and a huge window that you could sit in front of and see for miles. As we unpacked on the very first afternoon, Penny said the room made her feel uneasy. I thought she was absolutely off her rocker. It was amazing. We had enough room for a foosball table that we wanted one. It was awesome. At one point, I left Penny upstairs alone to hang some clothes in the closet while I grabbed a drink from the kitchen. When I came back, the closet door was closed and Penny was gone. Not thinking anything of it, I grabbed some of my clothes and opened the closet door, preparing to hang them. I was startled to see Penny standing in the closet closet, facing the wall. "What are you doing?" I asked her. She slowly turned and looked at me, confused. "I don't remember," she said, and stepped out of the closet and left the room. What a weirdo, I thought. That evening, I remember having the best night's sleep of my life. I was so refreshed and ready for the day when I woke up. However, when I looked over at Penny, her eyes were red and she looked like she'd been crying and exhausted. "Are you sick?" I asked her. She shook her head and hugged herself. "Just tired," she said, getting out of bed and going downstairs. Penny never slept in that room again. Things started to get really weird. Every night when I'd head to the stairs to sleep, she'd make a bed for herself on the couch. Every morning she'd come into the room only if I was standing in there with her, and she'd grab her clothes as quickly as she could and leave the room again. Eventually, she started hoarding her clothes in a pile in the corner of the laundry room and just getting dressed downstairs in the morning. She became very distant. She never talked to me anymore, and she tried to be out of the house as often as possible, never inviting me to go anywhere with her. I started to feel anger and bitterness towards her and thought she was being a selfish teenager. She was always tired and grouchy, and she snapped at my mother all the time. At one point, my mother even threatened to ground her and make her sleep in our room. But she flipped out and cried hysterically and begged her not to. Finally, one evening, my mother, who was close to snapping from frustration about my sister's odd behavior, blurted out, "What is wrong with you? Why won't you sleep in your own bedroom? You're 17 years old. Why do you hate it so much here? Why are you acting so terribly towards all of us?" Penny looked at all of us. "Do you really want to know?" she asked. "Yes," my mother answered for us. "I really want to know." Penny took a deep breath and blew it out hard, like she was warding off a panic attack. "There's something in that room," she said. "I saw a black shadow in the closet. And every night, when Rachel's asleep, I hear heavy footsteps coming from that room. At 1 a.m. every night, the door to that room creaks open, and I hear footsteps coming down the stairs. I count the steps. Right before they reach the bottom, they stop. I throw on the light, and there's no one there. Please do not make me go back into that bedroom." We all looked at Penny, not knowing what to say. Even though I knew she was clearly off her rocker, I still felt a little creeped out. I mean, I was sleeping in that room every night. However, I'd never seen a thing, and I'd never heard anything. I always slept really good. My dad cleared his throat and was the first to speak. "Okay, you don't have to sleep in your sister's room, but you need to know there's nothing weird in this house. never seen or heard a thing. It's all in your head. Penny glared at me. It is not in my head. You just wait. Someday you'll understand. At the time, I really didn't understand. For months, I slept like a baby, and Rachel seemed to get worse. When it was finally time for her to head off to college that fall, none of us felt too bad about openly admitting to each other that we were glad to get a break from her. She stepped out of the house, barely acknowledging any of us, and drove off to start a new life, basically. I laid in my bed that night and stewed for a while, thinking how awful my sister had become. At around 10 p.m., there was a scratching at my closet door. I ignored it, thinking it had to be nothing. Suddenly, the closet door slowly creaked open. I froze. However, nothing happened after that, and I fell back asleep. The next day, Penny called from college. Already. She was a complete, bubbly, obnoxious, happy chatterbox, telling us all about how amazing her dorm was and how nice her roommates were. And she made it a point to go on and on about how refreshed and well-rested she suddenly felt. As if something had been lifted from her soul. We were all happy to hear that she was in such a good mood finally. Later that evening, I was watching a movie with my parents on the couch. At one point, I must have drifted off to sleep, because when I opened my eyes, they had gone off to bed. I was feeling too comfortable to get up and go up those stairs, so I decided to just sleep where I was. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 1 a.m. I began to close my eyes when I was suddenly startled by a noise from above. It sounded like someone was dancing on my bedroom floor. Then the humming started. I couldn't believe it. She had been telling the truth. All this time, I had been in that room when this was happening, and I didn't even know. Then, before I could even really think about anything else, I heard a door creak. It was my bedroom door opening by itself. Heavy footsteps. Slowly down the stairs. I tried to remember in my head how many stairs there were so that I could count them. I was too frightened. I couldn't think. I couldn't tell if the footsteps had stopped or if whatever it was had reached the bottom of the stairs. I was frozen in place and couldn't manage to make myself get up to turn on the light. I shook with fear. I felt a tapping on my shoulder. I turned my head and came face to face with a dark shadow that whispered, "Where is Penny?" The late shift. My dad wasn't one to believe in ghosts. He was never big on telling me fairy tale stories when I was younger either. He's a big, tough, macho guy, and he doesn't believe in anything unless he himself sees it. That all changed for him one evening at work. He worked the late shift at the old Reno prison. He said it was a really laid-back job. Mostly he just drove around in the security vehicle and checked out all the different areas to make sure that there was no one where they weren't supposed to be. My dad's boss was named Jack. One evening, Jack asked my dad if he would do some janitorial work, which was totally out of the norm and not something they normally asked the night guards to do. My dad wasn't one to argue, and he wasn't one to shy away from hard work, so he agreed. He was sent to go sweep the old chapel and to make sure that there was nobody in there that wasn't supposed to be. So my dad got in his truck and drove down to the chapel. He said that when he walked through the door, it was completely pitch black, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he just felt strange, and he had never felt like that before. Now again, my dad is not the type of guy that believes in tomfoolery, so he didn't think much of it, thought maybe there was just a chill in the air. He flipped on the lights and started to survey the room. After about a minute, a man who was wearing the exact same uniform as my dad stepped out of the office in the back. "Oh," my dad said, "are you here sweeping already?" The man smiled and waved. Yes, don't worry, I've got this covered." My dad was very confused. He didn't understand why Jack would have sent him all the way out here if somebody was already here doing the job. But, again, my dad wasn't one to argue or question things. So he just shrugged and said, "Okay, I'll let Jack know," and left. My dad got back in his truck and drove back over to the front office. It had been only about 15 minutes since Jack had sent him down to the chapel. "What in the heck are you doing back already?" Jack asked him. "There's no way that you swept that whole place and looked around that quickly." My dad looked at him, confused. "Another guard's already in there. He said he'd check." And I guess Jack didn't think anything of it, as long as the chapel was checked out and everything was fine and it was swept. This is where it gets a little creepy. About 3 days later, my dad said he was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case of all the old photos of other guards in the past. As he was browsing the photos, he said his heart sank and his blood froze. One of the pictures he came across was the very same guard that he had encountered in the chapel. Only the guard was dead. Apparently, about 4 years before my dad started working there, a riot had broken out in the chapel, and a guard was stabbed to death. That guard was the man that my dad saw. But out of the 12 years of working there, not once had he ever heard about the riot until that very moment. I don't know if they don't talk about it, if it scares them, if they're afraid that it'll run someone out of a job or what. But My dad is now a firm believer in the paranormal. The road trip. I was 9 years old in 1976. I was the youngest of 3 children. Over summer vacation that year, my parents had driven us from Pennsylvania to Maine, where we'd spent a week at a beach eating hot dogs, fudge, and other treats on the boardwalk. Sunburnt and tired, we were ready to get back home to enjoy the last 2 weeks of summer before school started again. I laid in the back of the station wagon and watched the road disappear behind us. I always used to joke that my parents up front could see the future, and I was staring into the past in the way back. My brother and sister, who were 13-year-old twins, were pressed against each other, passed out and dead to the world as they dreamt of who knows what. At one point, my dad mentioned we'd be stopping at the nearest motel, but we needed gas first to get there. So he pulled over at the nearest Shell station, and he and I went to use the bathroom, and I helped him pump gas. As my dad held the nozzle, a man walked up to him and asked him where he was heading and if it was at all possible to get a ride. Behind the man stood his son, a small boy who didn't look more than 4 or 5. He looked scared. My dad hesitated. He was a really nice guy, my dad, but he explained that his wife and us kids were with him, and he wasn't sure. The man pleaded with him, said he'd get out at the motel and find his own way from there. The boy stared at me. I felt bad for him. Well, my dad said. Next thing I knew, to my mom's utter horror, the man squeezed in next to my brother and sister, who had woken up, and squeezed even closer to each other, trying not to sit anywhere near this stranger. My sister smiled at him fakely, trying not to seem rude. His little boy climbed into the back next to me. None of that could happen today. Despite the fact that my mother wasn't pleased about it, it wasn't like it was a totally unheard of thing back then. I don't even think it was illegal or anything like that. We were a bit oblivious back then. I don't know which is worse, to be honest with you. Being oblivious and possibly having stranger danger, or living your life in fear and never doing anything. The man told my father about how he'd had a really bad year, and he was so grateful for my family's kindness to give him a ride. His son kept staring at me. It was making me increasingly uncomfortable. He was very pale, and I wondered if he might be carsick. I really hoped not, because I hated the sight of puke. I pulled one of my G.I. Joe toys out of my backpack and handed it to him. "Here, you can have this if you want," I said. This seemed to bring a smile to his face. He didn't say anything, but he started to play with the action figure. He seemed really happy until he suddenly realized that there was a toy knife in the action figure's hand. He stared at it for a long time, turning it over and over again in his hand. Then, out of nowhere, he threw it at me. It hit my shoulder hard. I was taken aback and I didn't know what to do. If he had been older, I would have yelled at him or thrown something back, but he was so little. I didn't know what to do, so I just looked out the back of the station wagon and watched the stars go by. When we pulled into the motel, I was relieved. The man shook my dad's hand and thanked him. "Where are you off to now?" my dad asked him. "Oh, I'll either get myself a room or I'll hitch a ride with a trucker. You folks have a good evening." With that, he walked away. His boy followed behind him. Not very closely, but he followed behind him. Neither of them spoke to each other. I was so tired that I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next morning, I walked down to the free breakfast bar. There at a table by himself, eating scrambled eggs and a donut, was the man we'd given a ride to. "Hello," I said. "Oh, hello, young man. How are you this morning?" "I'm okay. Where's your boy?" I asked. The man nearly choked on his eggs. "My what?" "Your son. You know, the boy who was with you last night?" I reminded him, thinking maybe he was already drunk. I'm afraid you're mistaken, young man. I have no children. I've never married either." Now, I wouldn't normally argue with an adult, but my sanity was being questioned. "Maybe he wasn't your son, but he was with you, remember? He's really small. He had on an orange shirt and a blue pair of jeans, remember?" The man dropped his fork, his hand shaking. He glared at me with bug eyes. "Look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about." He stood up quickly and stormed off, heading out the front door. "What was that all about?" my mom asked as she walked up behind me. "What did you say to that man?" I sighed. I asked him where his son was. "The boy that sat with me in the car last night? He tried to say there was no boy. He's nuts." My mom shook her head. "Okay, first of all, I don't want you talking to another adult like that. Do you understand me? Second of all, what are you talking about? There was no boy with that man. You were alone in the back seat." The rest of my family agreed. They insisted there was no boy. I insisted they were crazy. We had a little car trouble that day and ended up having to spend one more night at the motel. That evening, my mother was flipping through the channels and stopped suddenly on a local news broadcast. She dropped the remote and made a weird groaning sound. We all looked to the TV. There on the news was a big color photograph of the man we'd given a ride to. Then 2 other pictures popped up, and I froze. The newscaster began to speak. "Timothy Harden has been arrested and charged in the stabbing death of 5-year-old Andrew Larson and his 36-year-old mother, Carol Larson. Carol's body was found strangled in her bedroom, and Andrew's body was found in his bed, stabbed to death. Andrew was still wearing the clothes that he had worn to camp that day, an orange t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. I thought of the G.I. Joe in the car. We all cried for Andrew and his mom. We were in shock that we'd given a murderer a ride, and I never forgot the brief moment that I had with the sad ghost. I often hoped that he was able to move on and not follow around endlessly the man who did him harm. Maybe the minute Timothy was arrested, Andrew was at peace. I really hope so. And I never, ever pick up spare writers. Retail horror. In the mid-'80s, I worked at a Toys R Us in Sunnyvale, California. Even before I started working there were rumors going around for years that it was haunted. I didn't really care. I didn't believe in that sort of thing. And I had just gotten married, and my husband and I were starting out our lives together, so I just needed the job. My first 6 months there, I would hear all kinds of weird things. There were customers who would come up to me as I was checking them out at the register and tell me that when they were in the bathroom and they were the only ones in the stall, all 3 sinks would simultaneously turn on by themselves. And the second that they stepped out of the stall, all 3 faucets would turn off. Back then, we didn't have motion-censored technology, so I had no explanation to give them. They were night crew workers who refused to work alone in the toy aisles because they swore that that's where the most paranormal activity took place. One woman on the night crew quit because she swears that she saw a Raggedy Ann doll fly off the shelf and hit another employee in the back. She claimed that it was not the first time that she had seen something like that and wanted no more part of being around whatever happened to be lurking there. Other employees reported toys being out of place at night when they were the only ones there that could have moved them. Several customers had complained that someone in the puzzle and games aisle whispered their names and blew into their ears. Now, myself and several of the other front-end cashiers, we just thought these people were trying to get attention. You know, teenagers would come in with their mom and dad's cameras and try and capture this supposed ghost. No one ever did. At least, no one ever came back to show us anything. One evening, my fellow cashier Donna and I were asked to stay after closing for a meeting. The meeting ran late, and Donna and I had planned to get a drink afterwards. I called my husband to let him know, and I told Donna I'd be right out to the car after I'd used the bathroom. It was almost surreal still being in the store that late at night. It had a creepy vibe despite the fact that I didn't believe any of the stories. As I turned on the faucet to wash my hands, I looked in the mirror. My hair felt all of a sudden prickly, like static electricity prickly. I watched as my hair slowly lifted upwards in the mirror, and then I felt a hard tug and laughter. I clutched my hair to my head and ran from the bathroom and heard a bouncing sound behind me. A red ball from the toy department was bouncing by itself towards me. I can't even explain how terrified I was. It sounds nuts. I ran outside the door to the car. My head was still sore later that night from my hair being tugged so hard. And the creepy laughter, I still have problems getting it out of my head. I told Donna what had happened over our drink that I really did end up needing, and she admitted that she too had seen some strange things, but hadn't want to admit it. For the next 6 months that I worked there, I became like the others. I'd only use the bathroom during the day when I knew that there was someone else around. Then I quit the store altogether when I became pregnant with my first child. I was fascinated when a few years later, in 1991, psychic Sylvia Brown was part of a television special that highlighted our haunted Toys R Us. She formed a seance where she connected with the spirit and was told that the store had been built on an old ranch and that the spirit's name was Johnny, and he had worked for the owner of the ranch and had also fallen in love with the rancher's daughter. When she eventually rejected him, he was devastated and he never got over it. Sometime afterwards, he had a bad infection that left him slightly brain damaged, but still competent enough to continue his work. One day, he accidentally hurt himself badly while chopping wood and bled to death. No one in the seance was able to see the spirit, but his picture, or what is deemed to be him, can be seen in a photo that was taken with special equipment. The store has recently closed, as did all other Toys R Us stores. You have to wonder if the spirit of Johnny is still there and will haunt whatever happens to be built there. The G train. I've always hated riding the subway. It smells. It's always crowded. The people are either really rude, fairly creepy, nosy, chitty-chatty, or they smell. But hey, call me picky. I always tried to make sure that I sat next to people that were reading newspapers or holding briefcases and staring out the window. I knew these people would leave me alone. Paper readers minded their own business, and the briefcase holders were too tired from a long day's work to do any fair amount of chitty-chatting. I liked to be left alone. Unfortunately, on this late evening, the subway was pretty full. I had no choice but to sit down next to a man with no paper and no briefcase. He smiled and patted the empty seat next to him. I inhaled a deep breath and prepared to be annoyed. His name was Todd. I know because he told me the second I sat down. I barely had a chance to breathe. Todd was 54. He immediately wanted to know what my name was, where I was from, where I worked, my entire life story, yada yada yada. As I indulged him these details, trying not to sound annoyed, a young woman who looked to be no older than 25 was staring at us, intrigued by the conversation. Everyone is always so nosy. He told me about his wife, his 2 children who were off at university, his dog Rusty, his cat Mabel, his mother Terry, and half the people at his office. He droned on and on and on. And despite myself, believe it or not, I actually tried to get in a word edgewise once in a while, just to change it up. But he chatted away, droned on and on, viciously. Meanwhile, that girl was still staring at us, chewing obnoxiously on her gum. Her mouth hanging half open as she listened intently. I rolled my eyes. My new friend Todd didn't seem to notice, and neither did our nosy friend. Neither of them cared that I was annoyed. I looked out the window as Todd droned on and on, trying to drown out the sound of his droning on and the snap, smack, pop of Nosy Chick's gum. Weren't either of these 2 getting off at stops soon? This was becoming too much. Say, Todd, I said, how much longer until your stop? Just curious. Wanted to know if I needed to, stretch my legs to prepare to let you up. Oh, not for another 20 minutes, Todd said. I inwardly groaned. I knew it had to be done. Say, Todd, do you know that girl over there? She's been staring at you the entire time we've been talking. Todd looked over. I don't think so, he said. And just as I predicted, my new best friend, Todd, that I'd known for about half an hour, the longest half hour of my life, looked over at the girl and said, Hey, do I know you? The girl nearly choked on her gum. No, you don't, she said. How come you're staring at me then? He asked with no filter. The girl sat up straight, kind of embarrassed and nervous, both at the same time. It was great. Well, I was just confused. I thought maybe you were talking to me at first, but then I realized you weren't. Then I got really confused. What do you mean? Todd answered, confused himself. Well, she said, you've been talking non-stop for about half an hour, but I don't know who you're talking to. Todd looked at me. I grinned and shrugged. He looked back over at the girl. Ma'am, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm obviously talking to my new friend over here, he said and pointed at me. What friend? There's no one sitting there, the girl exclaimed. Todd looked back at me as I slowly disappeared, grinning my ass off. He looked back at the girl and began to sweat, turning fairly pale. What's wrong? She asked. You look like you've seen the dead. Todd just nodded and picked up a newspaper that was sitting underneath the seat I had just been sitting in, flipped through the pages, and started to read. Okay, so I lied. It wasn't the longest half hour of my life. time moves a little differently in my predicament. Desperation. I was 8 years old, almost 9, in the fall of 1991. We had just moved into a rural New Hampshire neighborhood. It was near the end of September. I was riding my bike down our little street after dinner. I was daydreaming about the upcoming weekend because Mom and Dad promised to take me and my sister to Storyland in the town of Glen before it closed for the season. I'd seen the commercials, and while it wasn't anything hugely spectacular like Disneyland, it still looked pretty cool. Now, there wasn't a lot of traffic on our little street, so my parents didn't mind if I rode by myself to get some exercise. I hadn't made any friends yet, so it was only me cruising down the road in third gear, my hair blowing in the crisp fall breeze. At the end of our street, there was an old church and what looked like an even older graveyard. I decided to do some exploring around. Graveyards didn't scare me. I'd always been told they were one of the more safer places in the world to be. No one to bother you, just bodies at rest. My mother and I used to do grave rubbings at our old church in Massachusetts. Some people thought it was morbid and horrendously disrespectful. Our pastor had always said that he thought it was a wonderful way to keep someone's memory alive. As I walked along the stones, I felt a great sadness at seeing how many tiny graves there were. I knew this meant that they were infants or small children. Some weren't even given proper names on their stones, just labeled as infants. "It's sad, isn't it?" a woman's voice from behind me stated. I turned to face her. "That they died so young, I mean," she said, her wild curly red hair whirling around her kind face. "Yes," I answered, "some of them don't even have names." "That's true," she said, stepping up beside me. "It's possible that it was too painful to name them, or their parents couldn't afford to have the names engraved. It's hard to say, really." I nodded and bent down to trace my finger along the dates on one of the stones. There was a picture of a dove etched on it. "I never had children of my own," she said, watching me closely, "but I'd hold on to them fiercely and never let them go. I'd never let them leave my sight." I laughed. "But they'd have to go to school. They'd have to be away from you at some point." The woman's friendly face all of a sudden crumpled and became distressed. "I'd homeschool them. They could stay home with me all the time. I'd make them clothes. I'd cook them all home-cooked meals. No McDonald's for my children. They'd love me unconditionally and never want to leave." She was starting to make me feel uncomfortable. I stood up and started to walk towards my bike. "Well, I better get back home now," I said. "Wait," she called after me. "There's one more grave you must see. It's absolutely fascinating." I hesitated, but followed her as her wild red hair blew in the breeze. We reached the top of the graveyard, fairly close to the back of the church. She led me to a freshly dug grave. "There," she said, "take a look at that." I looked down into the deep, empty hole. There's nothing there. "Look, it's starting to get dark. I really should be getting back." She grabbed my arm before I could take a step back. "No, take a closer look," she growled and threw me into the hole. I screamed and cried. I cried for what seemed like forever. The woman walked away from my sight. I had no idea if she was still up there and I just couldn't see her, or if she had left me all alone. But it was getting darker, and I was scared. Now I was scared of being in a graveyard. I couldn't climb out. I screamed and cried. It became very dark, and I became very aware of where I was in this darkness. I pictured bodies climbing out of their graves just to grab me. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my cheeks. I was afraid to cry out loud. I was afraid I'd scare myself from the noise coming from my mouth. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. I froze. I didn't dare speak. Then I heard my name being called. I screamed for help. After a few minutes of screaming back and forth, my dad found me. He called for help to get me out of the hole. I described to the police what had happened, and they made a report. They said it didn't sound like anybody in this small town currently, but that they would keep an eye out. They said how lucky I was that I'd left my bike in plain sight and that my dad had found me, because it was supposed to be a very cold night and I'd have likely frozen to death before anyone arrived at the church the following morning. I wasn't allowed to ride my bike alone for a very long time after that. As I was getting into my dad's car, I heard the officer say to him, "That grave was supposed to be filled in today, but they weren't quite done with the body yet. Terribly sad. Mrs. June died. You'd have not met her, I suppose, but she lived in this area her whole life. An orphan in and out of foster care as a kid. Never married, never had children. She was a lonely, sad soul." I swallowed hard. When they thought I wasn't listening, my mom and dad discussed the woman further. "Oh my God, when I was at the market earlier, I was behind two women who were gossiping about it," my mother said. "One of them said June was an old coot who was fired from volunteering at the hospital because someone overheard her say she wanted to bring one of the babies home with her. And the other one said that she'd attempted to kidnap a 3-year-old, but someone who had a soft spot for her at the police department made it go away." A few days later, the Sunday paper came out. I flipped it open to the obituaries. Right there, in a small picture, was the woman, her wild red curly hair resting against the original kind face that I had seen before she totally lost it on me. A burial notice was next to her picture. Today was going to be her official burial day. Her body must be ready now. I knew for sure the police would never find the woman who pushed me, because they'd never believe that she'd technically gone back to the scene of the crime for all of eternity.